Picture this. An official with one of Washington, D.C.'s top lobbying groups sits down for dinner with a journalist. The official is asked about the time their organization was caught on tape bragging about cutting a deal with the White House and whether it's impacted their group's influence on Capitol Hill. The lobbyist smiles, points to a napkin and says, proudly, in 24 hours we could have the signatures of 70 senators on this napkin. Now, that statement alone could be considered a huge scandal, especially if that lobbying group was, say, the gun lobby, the NRA, or Big Pharma, or Big Oil. There'd be headlines everywhere about the power of special interests and big lobbies, outrage from constituents and the media. A lot of Democrats would be lining up to take shots at that lobbyist. But believe it or not, that story I just told you is real, it happened, and yet it's barely ever mentioned. Because it wasn't an NRA official who said it, or a rep for Big Oil or Big Pharma or even the AARP. It happened back in 2005, and the quote about the napkin was from an official with AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, perhaps the most powerful and famous or infamous member of America's broad pro-Israel lobby. And today, we need to talk about AIPAC. Because despite over 70% of Americans saying that lobbyists in general have too much influence, despite AIPAC's shameless bragging about their brazen power and influence over our elected officials, their seemingly unlimited access to the people in charge, we just don't talk about AIPAC that much. Not in our mainstream media, for sure. And look, I get it. There are some very dangerous conspiracy theories out there about rich Jews controlling the government, the Jewish lobby, the puppeteers, the secret cabal that's really running the country. Anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracies that have led to hate and persecution of Jewish communities throughout history. These days, many of them are being perpetuated by Republicans who are hyper-obsessed with Jewish billionaire George Soros, who they blame for funding everything from the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville to the hush money trial against Donald Trump. And look, anti-Semitic tropes about rich Jews, whether they're Soros or the Rothschilds or the Jewish community in general, should absolutely be condemned. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about AIPAC. We're talking about a self-described powerful lobbying group, one that brags about its influence, puts out literature claiming that its conferences get more members of Congress than any other event bar the State of the Union, one that openly spends millions of dollars trying to unseat pro-Palestinian members of Congress. A group that in no way should be associated with bigoted conspiracy theories about Jewish space lasers or Jewish financiers, but absolutely should be associated with the wider, corrupt, anti-democratic role played by lobby groups in general, and absolutely should be rejected in the same way that we reject, say, the NRA. And just have a listen to one of their top targets, AIPAC's top targets this year, New York Congressman Jamal Bowman, who currently faces a primary challenge from George Latimer, a pro-Israel Democrat backed by AIPAC. Here is Jamal Bowman speaking with Ziteo's Cynthia Nixon just last week.
AIPAC represents special interests in politics, big money in politics, trying to buy elections. They represent all of that. When we win, inshallah, we show the world that you can challenge power and win, right? In a big way. And that's what's at stake.
And indeed, the stakes are high in the primary race for New York's 16th congressional district, where AIPAC has already spent over $10 million trying to unseat Bowman, making it the most that AIPAC has ever spent on a race. Bowman is, of course, not the only one AIPAC is going after. According to Politico, AIPAC is expected to spend $100 million this election year as they specifically take aim at pro-Palestinian progressives within the Democratic Party. And remember, AIPAC is actually quite successful when it comes to targeting and taking out members of Congress they disagree with, the ones they dislike. Take the 2022 midterms, for example, when AIPAC helped defeat Congress's most progressive Jewish member, Andy Levin, with their super PAC spending over $4 million against him in his primary. Of course, AIPAC's same super PAC, United Democracy Project, a rather inconspicuous name for a nakedly and hardline pro-Israel group, is now running attack ads against Bowman, just like they did against Levin, with many of those ads having nothing to do with Israel. They don't mention Israel. Funny that. Instead, the ads accuse Bowman of being unable to compromise, even with President Biden, citing Bowman's refusal to vote for the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. Now, maybe AIPAC could have gone around preaching about the virtues of bipartisanship, of reaching out across the aisle 10 or 20 years ago, back when the organization was widely considered to be bipartisan. But today that bipartisanship is long gone. AIPAC panders more and more to the far right. In fact, AIPAC's targeting of progressives has turned them into the perfect vessel for GOP megadonors trying to kill progressive policies. And looky here. Earlier this month, Politico reported that AIPAC has now become the biggest source of Republican donations in the most competitive Democratic primaries, making it a clear case of GOP meddling. Now, AIPAC would say that they're simply fighting off the extremists in Congress, a classic racist dog whistle they love to invoke against the non-white members of the squad. We've seen them use this before in their 2021 attack ad against Congresswoman Ilhan Omar when they told voters to stand against terrorists. Ah, yes, because calling out legitimate war crimes while being a black Muslim woman must make you pro-terrorism, right? The truth is that AIPAC couldn't care less about fighting actual extremism. Quite the opposite, they're actually supporting it. In the aftermath of January the 6th, during the 2022 midterms, AIPAC chose to endorse over 100 members of Congress who voted against certifying the 2020 election results, who chose to perpetuate Donald Trump's baseless election conspiracy theories even after those lies had inspired a violent insurrection from America's own right-wing extremists, or as the FBI likes to call them, domestic terrorists. So much for a united democracy. Oh, and just in case you think the people who dislike or are opposed to AIPAC are all brown Muslims like me, I would remind you that one of their most vocal critics is another pro-Israel lobbying group, a more liberal, more moderate pro-Israel lobbying group, J Street, which has accused AIPAC of undermining American democracy, as well as the, quote, true interest of American Jews and pro-Israel Americans who AIPAC often claims to represent. By the way, on the subject of who AIPAC represents, again, we have to be careful here. AIPAC consists of Americans, not Israelis, and we have to avoid the dual loyalty trope when it comes to American Jews. Having said that, AIPAC does often tend to take the Israeli government line over the American government line. For example, when it came to President Obama's Iran deal, and have done so for decades. Back in the 1960s and 70s, the prominent, influential, very respected Democratic Senator William Fulbright, the longest-serving chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in U.S. history, he said he wanted to see AIPAC register as a foreign agent, but it didn't go anywhere. Now, today, thankfully, some progressives in the Democratic Party are finally starting to take action to fight back against the influence of AIPAC, against this Republican front group. This past March, over 20 advocacy organizations, including Jewish Voice for Peace and Justice Democrats, launched a coalition called Reject AIPAC, which says its goal is to defend members of Congress who are being targeted by this pro-Israel organization. In 2022, squad member Summer Lee in Pennsylvania was successful in fending off a primary challenge from an AIPAC-backed candidate. Now, whether squad member Jamal Bowman in 2024 is similarly successful in his New York district, we shall see. Meanwhile, sadly, shamefully, inexcusably, the majority of elected Democrats in Congress continue to remain silent on AIPAC, and many of them continue to take money from AIPAC and its proxies, even as the GOP uses the organization to interfere in Democratic Party primaries, even as AIPAC itself just backs the Netanyahu government line here in Washington, D.C. Isn't it weird that we can criticize every lobby group on Capitol Hill, from the gun lobby to the oil lobby, but not the pro-Israel lobby, not AIPAC, not the group currently defending a genocide in the Middle East, not the group currently flooding Democratic primaries with Republican money. No, they're off limits, or you're an anti-Semite.